How do we deal with backlighted subjects? This topic was requested by a commenter, the binary wolf, and it somehow got me to thinking, what were our solutions back in the days of film, and what do I do these days to compensate for backlighted subjects? Now, in the past, during the days of film, when cameras did not always have a built in light meter, what we used was the good old handheld meter. When we encounter a backlighted subject, all we needed to do was place the handheld light meter in front of the subject and take an exposure reading. This is what is called an incident light reading. The translucent dome of the handheld light meter is facing towards the camera lens. This would be to measure all the light falling onto the subject and disregarding the light falling from behind the subject. And what this will do for you is that, yes, maybe your subject will be properly exposed, but your background would be totally blown out. So, to compensate for that, one of the best ways to do it would be to use what we call fill in flash or the flash fill. Now, the easiest way to use flash fill is with your camera's pop up flash. So, every camera nowadays has some sort of a pop up flash. And although it's not powerful enough for most subjects, this tiny flash will be enough for fill in purposes. And it's as simple as popping it up and taking the shot. But one caveat to that particular arrangement is that you have to set your flash to its maximum shutter sync speed, which is normally up to 1 over 200 on most cameras. But for our purposes, or just for you to try it out, set your camera at 1 over 100. That should do the trick. Now, you don't want your shutter speed to be too slow, because if your shutter speed is too slow, you're still going to blow out your backlight. So, a nominal speed of 1 over 100 should do the trick. Now, one of the best things that I found out over the years is the pop up or the fill flash technique works best on the manual mode setting. So, this way you can control your shutter speeds and your apertures. Because if you put the camera on any sort of semi automatic mode, like a shutter priority mode or an aperture priority mode, you will not get the full benefit of a properly balanced exposure because the camera is somehow going to decide on one thing or another. But if you know how to use the flash fill technique, you get a properly exposed subject and at the same time toning down the backlight from behind it. So you get a more pleasing exposure compared to just using the handheld meter or taking the shot without a flash fill. Now take note that when shooting a backlighted subject, the camera or the camera's light meter will measure the entire scene. The camera simply does not care about the subject. It will calculate the exposure based on the entirety of the scene, and that's about it. This is why it's important to introduce a separate light source at the front of the camera to balance out the backlighting from behind. Now take note, this same flash fill technique also works with small digicams like this Kodak M23. And it's as simple as setting your camera or setting the flash on your camera to the on position. This means that the camera will disregard any exposure reading and still fire the flash. Now, in addition to your pop-up flash, you can also use an external flash like this one. This is an aftermarket generic type flash which is not dedicated to any camera, but it has a power ratio setting. So the power ratio on the flash simply controls the amount of light that it gives out for every burst. So you can go from a powerful burst of light to the less powerful. And it really depends on the subject or how much light the subject needs to fill in to balance out the backlighting from behind. Now, one thing to remember is that digital photography is cheap. Back in the day, we had to rely on the flash guide number and the flash scales in order for us to calculate a properly balanced flash lighted image. Or we had to have a flash meter like this really old Seconic L308. I've had this thing for almost 30 years now, and it still works. But somehow, in this day and age, when cameras already have their own evaluative or matrix light metering, somehow I only use this flash meter only for external strobes, and sometimes just for the heck of it, I'd like to see my exposures if they compare with the camera's built-in light meter. So these days, it's so easy to take a photograph and everything is calculated in camera, and none of you don't have to use your brains anymore. But somehow, in this day and age when digital photography is so cheap, the best thing to do really is to experiment with your exposures. Find out how best to photograph your subjects. One thing to remember is to keep your flash synchronization speed at its maximum. And this technique works particularly well during the daylight when you have to use shutter speeds over 1/125th of a second. And most cameras will have a maximum flash sync speed of about 1 over 200. So 1 over 100 would somehow balance things out, and you don't get that half frame exposure simply because your shutter speed isn't synchronized with the flash at all. So as you can see, the flash fill technique isn't so complicated. My point here is digital photography is cheap. Just keep experimenting. But remember that in order for you to best balance out a backlighted subject would be to have a flash fill on your camera or a little bit off camera to get the best results. There's really no magic trick to it. It's a very simple technique that I've learned over the years and somehow perfected simply because technology has made it possible to get a properly exposed shot each time you press the shutter. So it's not really a problem nowadays, not like before when we had to have something like this in our pockets just to make sure that our backlighted subjects were properly exposed. And that's a wrap. I'm the Shuttermaniac. Until next time, make serendipity happen.